Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining US-Singapore Indo-Pacific Conversation Series number 3. Today, our theme is Regional Integration and the US-Singapore Economic Relations. I'm Hsien-Hsien Lei. I'm the CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore. I'm an epidemiologist with an interest in policy and the link between business and science. So in case you're wondering, I am Chinese American. I was born in Taiwan and grew up mostly in the San Francisco Bay Area. I left the US in 1998 after I married my Singaporean husband. And I've been living across Asia and the UK for the past many years and now based in Singapore for 13 and going. So today's agenda, we will have short remarks by each of our speakers, followed by a discussion, then audience Q&A. And at about 11:30, for those of you in the 2021 cohort of the US-Singapore Young Leaders Program, you'll be having a closed-door dialogue with our speakers. So before I introduce our speakers, I want to take a few minutes to tell you a little bit about the American Chamber of Commerce here in Singapore. AmCham in Singapore stands for Advocacy, Business Insights, and Connections. And those are the values that we hope we deliver consistently every day for our 550 and over member companies. And the goal, in case you know anyone and can help us tell everyone about how important AmCham is the goal is to get to 1,000 member companies. Let's see how we go. AmCham also represents member companies in demonstrating the contribution of American businesses to Singapore. And even today, when I speak to Americans in Singapore and other business leaders, many people are not aware that the US is actually the largest contributor of foreign direct investment to Singapore, 7 times higher than the next country down on the list, which is China. So over the past year that I've been CEO and something that we'll continue to work on this year, we will be demonstrating the contribution of American businesses to Singapore in the areas of business stability, sustainability, and growth, innovation and R&D, as well as careers. And we will likely touch upon these topics today. So let me now introduce our speakers. Ambassador Frank Lavin, CEO and founder of Export Now. Export Now is a US firm that operates e-commerce stores in China for international brands. Established in 2010, Export Now is the largest offshore operator of China e-commerce stores, helping brands from around the world in strategy and operations. Many of you will have known Ambassador Lavin when he served as Undersecretary for International Trade at the US Department of Commerce from 2005 to 2007. And we were fortunate enough to have him as our ambassador here in Singapore from 2001 to 2005. And he also helped to negotiate the US-Singapore Free Trade Agreement. Thank you so much for that, Ambassador Lavin. In the private sector, Ambassador Lavin has served in senior finance and management positions in Hong Kong and Singapore with Edelman, Bank of America, and Citibank. And previously, Ambassador Lavin, I keep changing the honorific, but we all know it's you, served in George H.W. Bush and Reagan administrations, working in the Department of Commerce, Department of State, National Security Council, and the White House, and also served as director of the White House Office of Political Affairs from 1987 to 1989. And last but not least, Ambassador Lavin is a prolific writer. If you haven't read his books yet, you must. He is co-author of Export Now, which is published by Wiley, and also a World War II history book, Homefront to Battlefront. And I'm sure in his remarks, he will share his thoughts as in his roles as a trustee of the Asia Foundation, on the boards of Advanced MedTech Holdings and SC Health Corp, and also his involvement in other organizations here in Singapore. We miss you, Frank. I can't believe you're in California right now. We'll get you off of mute in a few minutes. I'm going to introduce now Nydia Ngiow, who is Senior Director, BowerGroupAsia. Thank you for joining us today, Nydia. Nydia most recently managed the China program at the American National Standards Institute in Washington, D.C., where she brought together technical, business, and policy leaders to find solutions to issues affecting U.S.-China trading relations to strengthen U.S. market access in China. Nydia was with the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industry for over 6 years. She was in charge of negotiations for free trade agreements, bilateral investment treaties, and at the World Trade Organization. Nydia served other roles as well. First Secretary of Economics at the Embassy of Singapore in Washington, D.C. from 2014 to 2017, and also managing U.S.-Singapore economic and trade relations, and advocating for TTP, Trans-Pacific Partnership in the US Congress. We'll get back to that, Nydia, I'm sure. Prior to her time at MTI, Ministry of Trade and Industry, Nydia worked for the Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore, another very interesting topic in these times, managing international relations with Europe and Latin America and working on international aviation environment issues. Thank you so much, Nydia, for being with us today. And Stephen Chan, my good friend Stephen Chan. I've had the pleasure of working with Stephen for the last year or two. It feels like we've known each other forever. You'll see why. He is Senior Director and Regional Head of Government Relations, Asia Pacific at PayPal. PayPal is a homegrown California company where I am from. It's so fantastic to have such a well-known company here as well participating on the panel. Prior to joining PayPal, Stephen was the Managing Director and Regional Head of Regulatory, Industry, and Government Affairs for State Street, based in Hong Kong. And here is where we have a strong connection because Stephen also served as Director of Government Relations and Corporate Social Responsibility for AmCham in Shanghai. Stephen held previous positions in the US government as a Foreign Service Officer with the Department of State, with overseas and domestic assignments in Mexico, China, and in DC, and as Deputy Director for China and Mongolia with the Department of Commerce. Currently, Stephen is Chair of the AmChams of Asia Pacific, and we do have a big regional summit for AmChams of Asia Pacific coming up from March 9th to 11th. So maybe we'll pop it into the chat for you guys so you can check out the summit, which is coming up. Stephen is also a board member of the Emerging Payments Association Asia and the National Center for APEC, and an industry leader of the APEC Asia Pacific Financial Forum. I think I've covered it all, and I'm exhausted already because your bios are so extensive. So thank you to all three. And right now, what I'm going to do is ask Ambassador Lavin to share his thoughts on our theme today, and each of our speakers will be doing that in turn. Ambassador Lavin, over to you.
Thank you so much, and that was such a lovely introduction, very gracious of you. I'm delighted to be here. I'm very happy to be on a panel with Nydia and Stephen, and I know I'm going to learn a lot today as well. And I see so many friends on the participants list. I hope they're out there, but Tommy Ko, particularly delighted you're there, Prof. Ko, and you mentioned that I was able to help with the U.S.-Singapore Free Trade. Well, Tommy was the lead negotiator and put in several years in his life on that, and deserves a lot of applause and respect for his good work on that. I saw Brenda Foster on the list, who longtime head of AmCham Shanghai, now in Hawaii. And Brenda, I hope you're out there, and many, many other friends. I can't go through them all, but special thanks to AmCham, to RSIS, and the Pacific Forum for pulling this together. Thank you for doing this. And look, I only have a few points to make. I'm generally optimistic about prospects in the region for trade, but there's one big question mark, and that's what I want to spend my time today on. And I'd say every country in the region has some sort of a debate going on about economic rationalism versus economic nationalism. How open can we be on trade? At what pace? What special circumstances? Everybody's going through this, but every country knows on some level that open societies move ahead, and that the logic of trade overwhelms whatever concerns there might be about trade. So the question is mainly figuring out sort of the pace and the circumstance and the structure to allow for improvements in trade rather than being against trade. And I'd say there's a special set of issues, the future-oriented issues, where the architecture hasn't kept up. These are the tech issues, where frequently commercial activity, tech activity, innovation outpaces the role of the regulators and the government bodies. So I think there's a special emphasis that needs to be placed on the tech side so that we can facilitate cross-border tech activity. And let me spend most of my remarks on the one big question mark. I think the one big question mark is the United States. That a new US administration means the US is going to take a fresh look at trade, but I'm going to outline in my few minutes with you sort of the good news and bad news. And by bad news, with which I'll start, I mean, what are the factors that might constrain the Biden administration on trade, might inhibit whatever trade initiatives it might otherwise engage in? And by good news, I mean the enablers or the facilitators of trade, and then I'll sum it up. But the constraints, look, there's a huge constraint regarding the Biden administration's view on trade, and it is simply management bandwidth. How much time do you want to spend on this issue? How much time can you spend on this issue? How much political capital are you going to allocate to this issue? And I was talking to somebody senior in the Biden team a few weeks ago, and I gave him my thesis, which was, I said, if we sit down 1 year from now, the 1 year anniversary of the Biden presidency, and we evaluate, we give the presidency a scorecard. I said 90% of that grade, 90% of those marks will be driven by three factors: the economy, coronavirus, and tone, how he conducts himself. Meaning trade and everything else, infrastructure, everything else you want to do is in that 10%, right? And the fellow said, yes, you're right, you got it. So the point is, trade is important. President Biden has said trade is important, but how important? And what kind of political capital is he going to allocate? So the first constraint is management bandwidth. Second constraint is there is a limited trade constituency in the United States. And there are hostile elements in the president's own base, right? Mainly organized labor is unexcited about trade. And the third constraint on trade is sort of a variation of the second point about the politics of it, is success on trade gets you what? What does success on trade get you? Well, if you're cynical, if you're in a cynical moment, you say, it gets you nothing politically. It gets you nothing. The benefits of trade are long-term and diffuse, and the pain of trade liberalization is immediate and acute. And by the way, in many polities, I'd say definitely in the United States, the sense of pain or the willingness to claim pain can outpace the reality of pain. So if you ask steel workers in America, what is their problem? They're going to say it's trade. They're not going to say, actually, automobiles today use 50% less steel than they did 20 years ago. Or they're not going to say composite materials. They're not going to say other kind of factors, but they're going to say it's Japan or China or Germany or India steel. So those are the constraints, right? You're getting into a bit of a thicket. Those are the constraints. But what are the enablers? Well, the very important enabler here is the economic logic. As I mentioned before, countries that engage in trade move ahead. Those that do not stagnate. As sure as I'm talking to you, President Biden agrees with this thesis. The trade is a good for the country, and a wise president ought to seek it. I also think, as an enabler, there's the example of President Biden's predecessor, that he postured on trade. You could say he demagogued on trade. He played to populist instincts on trade. And I think Biden sees this, and Biden does not want to say what I am doing is repeating Trump political moves on trade, but I'm going to try to pull back and try to do something purposeful on trade, something that is helpful to the economy. I would also note that public opinion on trade has shifted over the past 4 years, but we've seen a real move in general public opinion. If you look at Gallup poll, you'll see overwhelming support for that trade helps the economy rather than trade hurts the economy. So the president has more leeway than you might suppose. The final point I'll make as an enabler is the geopolitics, that Biden is keenly aware that US needs to improve its connectivity in the region, and that trade provides sort of the best mechanism for win-win architecture, win-win approaches. So it's an important tool in a foreign policy toolbox beyond the economic benefit for trade. Those are enablers. Now, let me lay out to you a modestly positive scenario of what's going to happen. And I see 4 or 5 steps. First, 2 steps are underway: the team and the positioning. The team isn't in place. USTR hasn't been confirmed. Commerce Secretary hasn't been confirmed, but within weeks, they should both get confirmed, and then the subordinate officers get confirmed as well. So, and what I find encouraging is that Biden has picked serious policy professionals for those leadership jobs. These jobs didn't go to cronies. These jobs didn't go to donors. These jobs didn't go to sort of celebrities or people I owe favors to, but these jobs went to people who can get the job done. Technical specialists who have strong political credentials, strong mechanical skills. So that should be encouraging. A really good team. Positioning is interesting. And you could interpret this either way, but I'm going to interpret it positively. It's interesting to me that the administration is using a bit of populist rhetoric. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan talked about a trade policy for working families, not for Goldman Sachs. A little bit unusual rhetoric to specifically denigrate a company by name, I have to say. But I'll tell you this, I think this is the way to get it done. I think this is the way to get it done. Meaning, if you say, in general, there are two ways to get something on trade through. And one is to say trade is an unalloyed good and it helps the United States play to its comparative advantage, and we all have to support trade on its merits. Which, by the way, that's what we used to do, is make that argument for trade on its merits. I think you say that's a tough row to hoe. If you have to say, we are going to do it right, and we are going to use trade as a vehicle to protect, help certain constituencies in the US, and trade as a mechanism for these constituencies, that I think is more politically feasible. I think you're now positioning trade for broader acceptance, right? So I think he's doing this out of wisdom, not out of demagoguery, right? But there is a populist positioning. So first is team, building the team. Second is positioning. Third is he needs to build an internal and external consensus. Internal consensus, I mean, where does the US Senate stand? Where does the US House stand? What kind of price does he want to pay? How much political capital does he want to invest? And external consensus means, talk to me about TPP. Are all TPP partners on board the US showing up late, having started the party, exiting the party, now rejoining the party? Is everybody happy with that? Well, we'll see. I think Japan will play a key role in guiding that through. I also think building that internal consensus will be important. Well, I'm looking very closely at this recent dust up this week about Neera Tanden, Biden's nominee for OMB director. What's really interesting to me is there's no doubt in my mind Biden wants her in. He's sincere in his nomination. She's encountered some difficulties. And I think he's taking a very practical view in pricing, meaning how much of my presidency do I want to build around this one nomination? Well, the answer is, I think we're in the middle of the pricing mechanism, but the answer is it's finite. It is finite. I'm not going to stake my presidency on any one initiative or one individual. I've got a lot of other things to do. Trade is going to be in that category. So he has to go through this internal consensus building mechanism and say, what price do I have to pay to get something through that's meaningful? How far down the green and blue, the labor and environmental accords and TPP modification do I have to go to be able to sell it internally? But I've got to balance that around what Japan will take and what the other TPP members will take, right? So that is going to take months and months and months of work. But I think you get a soft launch and you move incrementally, and I think you get a formal proposal by the end of the year or a formal statement by the end of the year. So I'm taking an optimistic view that step by step, the United States is back in the TPP game, back in the effort by the end of the year, right? That's the end of my presentation, Hsien.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Lavin. A lot to unpack there. And I'm sure that our other speakers, Stephen and Nydia, will also have some commentary as well. But definitely 2 points for our young leaders to take note: the understanding that you have limited bandwidth to devote to your priorities. So how do you allocate your resources? And secondly, how do you utilize your political capital so that you do get things done rather than get bogged down? A very important leadership lesson for us to learn. Nydia, may I ask you to give your remarks next?
Sure, thank you. And good morning, everyone, and thanks for having me as part of this panel. I think, when we look at strengthening economic and trade partnerships post-pandemic, I'm happy to share my views from an ex-civil servant's perspective. And I think, my remarks today will be a bit more Singapore focused, looking at things from a Singapore, or I guess ASEAN lens. So I think, when we talk about regional integration and US-Singapore economic relations, a good thing to note, especially when we're looking at it from the Singapore perspective, is that, the US and Singapore has had a long-standing economic relationship, and that is expected to continue strengthening in the Biden administration. So some fun facts for you guys. Back in 1966, actually, the US was the first country to sign a bilateral investment agreement with Singapore, not long after Singapore's independence in 1965. And of course, as Ambassador Lavin would know, Singapore was the first country in the Asia Pacific to have an FTA with the US, which I believe is currently 17 years old and is still regarded as a gold standard, high-performing FTA for which businesses continue to provide positive feedback. And this also reminds me a little bit of like the talking points I would use to have to draft for Ambassador Murpuri when I was at the embassy. So bear with me a little bit. And I also want to point out that, the US investment in Singapore actually amounted to about 288 billion in 2019, which actually accounts for 30% of US investment in the Asia Pacific. And that's almost twice of the US investment in China and India combined. And luckily for Singapore, we managed to slip under the radar during the dark period of the past 4 years because, thankfully Singapore, the US enjoyed a trade surplus with Singapore in both goods and services. With a Biden administration, there are undoubtedly very big expectations from the world, which includes a possible return to the TPP. But I think expectations need to be managed. So while I am optimistic, like Ambassador Lavin, I would say I'm a bit more cautiously optimistic. I think that returning to the CPTPP would be a complicated process when we transition from the TPP to the CPTPP. There were a number of tweaks that were made, particularly in the IP chapter, and that was where the US, fought a lot of the other 11 members to try to get a lot of provisions that would be more, more favorable to the pharmaceutical industries under when Senator Orrin Hatch was in the Senate Finance Committee. And a lot of looking at the political capital and looking at the complicated process, I don't think that, big regional deals are going to be the way forward for this US government, especially when they haven't, they're only starting Senate confirmation of, the USTR Catherine Tai on February 25th. And then there's also the Trade Promotion Authority that is expiring later this year. I have nothing but great things to say about Catherine Tai. She's a personal friend, and she's done really well, with the USMCA, working across the aisle and pushing for a lot of policies that would have gotten that were required to get Dems on board. When I was at the US Embassy and fighting for TPA and TPP, only 28 Dems, I believe, supported TPA back in 2015. And so that really is an uphill battle to try to get more Dems on board, especially when you have a worker-centered policy that they have talked about. It's very domestic focused, but then how do you square that with folks in Asia Pacific calling out for attention to the space? I think that's something that we need to really consider. That being said, I think a quick win or maybe a low-hanging fruit could be an early sectoral deal on digital economy. I think it would be a useful way to send a clear and strong signal that the US is ready to strengthen its engagement with the Asia Pacific region. Singapore has existing digital economy agreements with Australia, Chile, and New Zealand. And these are to some extent, based on the provisions in the CPTPP and the USMCA, which is why I think it will be something that, would be a fast and early way to send a strong signal to highlight that the US administration is ready to strengthen its engagement with the Asia Pacific. With sectoral deals, sometimes, then that begs the question of whether or not that would be a bit more difficult to obtain regional integration. But I think if we were to use an APEC term, this could be a pathfinder and grow into a regional deal if we adopt a more building block kind of approach. ASEAN's digital economy is projected to exceed 240 billion by 2025. So there is great potential in this possible path forward. The other aspect that we need to consider is really Singapore is often happy to serve as a model for the region, but the extent of Singapore's influence remains to be seen. The region is, of course, more complicated, and oftentimes other countries don't like to be reminded that they're lagging behind. So I think, expectations need to be managed on both sides, on the US and also on the Asia Pacific, that there are possible pathways forward, but those might take a bit more time. And that's all I have to say at this point, and welcome further questions later.
Thank you so much, Nydia. I can tell that you are very attuned to the sensitivities of both being a leader in the region, but also providing some soft influence, because certainly from a public health point of view, where I'm from, it's been something where you want to lead and set by example, but also not to force other countries that have different situations into going down the same path. So I like that concept of pathfinder, but also allowing people to find their own path, what suits them. So thank you, Nydia. Stephen, may I ask you to give your remarks now? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you to the Pacific Forum and for AmCham Singapore to invite me and to organize this event. I think right now, given what's happening in the US with the snowstorm, anything with the word Pacific and Singapore sounds nice. Another great thing about following with two esteemed panelists is that they have done all the hard work. So it's not much more for me to say, but I do want to make my remarks brief so that we can get into the Q&A on 2 points. One is Singapore is a strategic and important market and location for US businesses. And the second is that it offers immense amount of opportunities for American businesses through accessing Singapore and through Singapore. On the first point, we have been living through the pandemic the past year, and one trend that has been has never been more important is the shift in terms of commerce from physical to online. And as a digital payment, we have definitely witnessed this shift in terms of, we have had a record-breaking year in all of the history of PayPal. We also have, it is expecting that our transactions and revenue and consumers will grow 2-3 times in the next several years. And so in terms of what PayPal is doing here in the region, Singapore is our international headquarters. And what that means is that through Singapore, PayPal overseas and conduct businesses in 150 markets, and not only in Singapore, but also and across the APAC, but also in other regions as well. And Singapore is then an important location for us as an American company. It's also an important location for many American companies who has their regional headquarters here in Singapore. In APAC, we are in 15 markets, and we have been in APAC for nearly 2 decades now, previously as part of eBay, and when PayPal became independent, more than 5 years ago, we have been servicing these markets there. Now, the pandemic has really accelerated the transition. Being a digital payments, we have seen this all across the Pacific region, and it's really largely due to the growth of the digital economy and e-commerce, as Nydia has highlighted, that now in ASEAN, it is expected that e-commerce will triple in the next 5 years, from 100 billion in 2019 to 300 billion by 2020. And reports after reports have shown that consumers across the region, especially in ASEAN, has turned to digital services as the pandemic emerged, and digital payments across the Asia has already tripled in the past year. Things like demand for e-wallets, QR codes, digital banking, remittances, etc. So in short, Singapore is a strategic location for American companies here in the region, and simply because there are very strong regulatory and rule of law here in Singapore, strong support from the government to not only help companies establish here, but also grow and scale by encouraging innovation and providing all sorts of support, from incentives to infrastructure support. The other point I want to highlight around the whole strategic piece of Singapore is, Singapore is only among a handful of countries that have a trade surplus with the US. And it is not a small thing to emphasize, given this trade sentiments right now, as Frank highlighted. last year in 2019, 2020 statistics haven't come out yet, but in 2019, the US had a surplus of over $18 billion of Singapore. And you put that in context, Singapore is the size of equivalent to Rhode Island with a population of 6 million. And it is the US 14th largest trading partner in 2019. So that is pretty impressive given the size of Singapore. And so I just want to leave that thought for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Love Rhode Island. So it's a good comparison. Before we move on to our Q&A, but I also want to open it up to the audience. If you do have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. I'm definitely monitoring it. I'm thinking you would be able to put questions in the chat, and then, or you could raise your hand and I could unmute you. So there's various ways to be able to ask your questions. Okay, so feel free to do that while we, any thoughts come to your head, go ahead and leave us those comments and I will get to you. But first I'm going to stay with Stephen a bit, because what we've been seeing in Singapore during the COVID-19 pandemic is that certain industries have clearly suffered, right? Travel and leisure as an example. But there are industries that have been doing very well, including tech, including finance, digital, everything that you talked about. Do you think there are advantages to being an American business in this space of tech and digital versus some of your competitors that are not American? I mean, what would place American businesses at an advantage to leverage these opportunities?
That's a great question. When I was looking at the trade statistics in terms of the volume of trade between Singapore and the US, as well as the trade surpluses, and looking at the sectors that are top trading goods and services into Singapore, it is finance, it is insurance, it is services. And Singapore being a small country, with not a lot of natural resources, services is really one of the competitive advantages. And with the government's emphasis and support for service companies, service-related companies, I think American companies in the services area, can really thrive here in Singapore. And as I highlighted, Singapore, it is a gateway to ASEAN, it's a gateway to Asia, and it's also a gateway to international markets outside of the region. And simply because of the policy regulations and the type of support that the government has given, and it ties to the economic and the trade incentives in the region, as Frank highlighted, and Nydia, the digital economy, e-commerce, all that acceleration is actually set a great environment for American companies to thrive here in Singapore.
Excellent, thank you. I mean, in keeping on this topic about trends and opportunities for American businesses, possibly an advantage, when you think about other countries. Nydia, I was going to ask you to comment about ASEAN. So just a little sneak peek for our audience. Every year, AmCham Singapore, along with other ASEAN AmChams, we do a survey called the ASEAN Business Outlook Survey. Now, truth is, last year we didn't put it out because the survey had been conducted before COVID. And so we thought to ourselves, let's hold on to those results. And what we're going to do is launch them this year by comparing 2019 survey results with 2020. So you're going to get a pre-COVID snapshot and a mid-COVID snapshot. So those results are coming out soon. But what we're already seeing, this is the sneak peek part, we're seeing increased confidence in US companies, US as a whole. In terms of businesses here in ASEAN, we're seeing increased interest in being optimistic about doing business here in ASEAN. So even though there's been a lot of turmoil and a lot of global stressors on the economy, on public health, still businesses in this region continue to see opportunities. Tech is obvious, but Nydia, have you seen any other industries that are on the up? Healthcare, perhaps? What trends and opportunities are you hearing about?
I think, given this current pandemic and the world that we're living in, I think definitely healthcare sector has been on the up and up. If you look at the number of the manufacturing output for Singapore in the last year, you'd see that there were several months where, Singapore's export numbers did not go down solely because of the strength of the pharmaceutical sector manufacturing. We have, 8 of the top 10 world's largest manufacturing companies in Singapore, a lot of them with manufacturing plants like GSK, MSD, Pfizer, so on. And they're manufacturing their products and exporting them to the world. It's not just, Singapore, which is a tiny market for them domestically. So that's definitely something that's on the rise. And now with countries gearing up for vaccine distribution programs, you're going to see more logistic companies playing a big part in how that vaccine gets transported. We know that the Pfizer vaccine, for instance, has a lot of requirements. When we're looking at minus 70 degrees Celsius. And so cold chain supply definitely comes into play. And I think I see our friends from FedEx on the call as well. They're playing a big part in getting, vaccines to Singapore and to the rest of the region as well. And so that's definitely something that will be of top of mind, I think, in terms of trends and opportunities. Supply chains are also always going to be a topic of interest. I think, there were a lot of concerns and fears about the supply chains being disrupted during the pandemic, when you see countries just isolating themselves from the rest of the world. And I think, Singapore was great in that it came out really fast, came out with joint statements with other countries to say, we're all for free and open, secure supply chains to make sure that, even as countries try to keep themselves and their citizens safe, we recognize the impact of globalization and how supply chains are not just limited to one region even, and I think I really appreciated how Singapore government was really effective in coming out with such joint statements to state their interests and to then bring on other countries on board. I think that shows real leadership.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Singapore's positioning during the pandemic, keeping trade and supply chain moving, that was critical to some of the recovery that we're already beginning to see, the availability of personal protective equipment. So what a great point. Ambassador Lavin, I'm going to turn things on its head because I've asked Nydia and Stephen to comment on why American businesses can do so well in our region. But one time I did reach out to you for help for one of our member companies that's not American owned, and they wanted to know how they could do well. So if you were going to advise a non-American company, who knows that American companies are doing well in Singapore and investing and committed to Singapore, how would you advise a non-American company about the opportunities in ASEAN?
Yeah, thanks, Shen. First, I don't think it's radically different. I mean, we don't go into these we don't go into these market situations, flying our flag. We're here providing goods or services. We're trying to find the right customer. We're trying to build out a slate of activity. So it's not a primarily a geopolitical statement. So I don't think it is radically different, whatever your pedigree is. But I think something that I've seen time and time again with market entry is countries want to expand, they want new markets, they want new customers, they want new revenue, but they don't realize that a new market involves a J curve. A new market involves disproportionate expenditure. It involves new advertising because people don't know you in this market. It might involve very inefficient advertising. If you're saying, I've never had a Thai social media campaign before, I now have to gin this up de novo. Maybe 85% of the content is just from my home market, whether that's the Netherlands or the US, but you nonetheless have to create whole cloth, this Thai language set of social media activity and digital activity and outreach activity and salespeople and sales reps. So you have enormous inefficiencies and some step function costs. The other somewhat inhibiting factor is you're not at scale. You're saying, I might have a total addressable, I might have $100 million of sales in the EU if I'm this Dutch company of $100 million. Fantastic. All of Thailand in 3 years might represent 1 or 2 million. And you say, to get that 1 or 2 million in sales, I have to have a reasonable, reasonable apparatus in Bangkok. I have to have a CFO and salespeople and operations people and logistics people, and I have to do all of this work, even though it's just chasing a million or two, right? So you get a frustration factor. I would say the main challenge in new market entry is time horizon, that you just have to tell yourself it's going to be a journey. It's going to be multiple years. There's going to be extra cost and there's going to be these inefficiencies. But if I can do that, and by the way, all of the great global majors from Nike to P&G to Heineken, all of them have gone on this journey, right? And the Japanese automakers, Coca-Cola, all of them have said, if there's one person in Bangkok who wants a Toyota, I want to be able to sell it to them. And of course, it's going to be additional cost for me to get my car in and get it certified and have a Toyota dealership network. Of course, it's going to be inefficient. And I've spent 100 years in my home market of Japan building up these efficiencies, right? But I have to be willing to go on this journey if I want to reach the Thai consumer. So I would say this, on any given day, it is the wrong decision to go into new market. But cumulatively, it's always the right decision. So on any given day, you can say there's a million reasons why I don't want to go to Bangkok, right? It's complicated, expensive. But if you never go there, you're never going to enjoy success. So this company just has to say, we're going to have a 3-year or a 5-year program for Bangkok and for Indonesia and for Malaysia. And we're just going to have to invest a little money and we're just going to have to get our game up a bit and make these wonderful markets work for us. The smart people are doing this. Call up Nydia, get the Bauer Group to help you. Call up Stephen, get PayPal on your side. You've solved 2 important challenges right there.
Wow, that's a tremendous endorsement. I hope you guys got that down. Thank you so much, Ambassador Lavin. I also want to put in a plug for our colleagues over at the U.S. Embassy in Singapore. When there are companies that want to, enter Singapore to set up and trying to understand the landscape, get some assistance, our colleagues at the Commerce Department also have a tremendous team that can provide support. And of course, there's always AmCham who can help you make connections and understand better how to set up business in Singapore, how to run effectively, and similarly for all of the other markets within ASEAN. Now I'm going to go back to Nydia. I wanted to, ask you a bit more about Singapore and how things work here. I think our audience, some of them are not based here, maybe have limited experience. And Singapore has done so many things well. You had talked earlier about, the trade, Stephen talked about the trade surplus as an example. I mean, in terms of Singapore's position in ASEAN and its relationship with the US, how does the trade surplus play into it? How do we better understand how Singapore has developed their strategy in this environment of where, you just need to be able to take care of your own citizens, but at the same time be a good global citizen? What's the Singapore approach, would you say?
I feel like I might not be the best person to answer this when Ambassador Ko was on the line.
But you're on the panel, so you're kind of stuck with it.
I know. I think that what has always worked in Singapore's favor is that we are a very pragmatic and realistic country. Being such a small city state, it's kind of been ingrained in us since childhood, really, that we need to fight for survival at all costs. I remember, a lot of social studies classes talking about the founding of Singapore. And, when you look at, when you have to watch your first prime minister cry on national TV because of, the circumstances of our independence, it kind of instills in you this need for resiliency. And I think that that's something that's been reinforced over this past year as we talk about how do we bounce back from the pandemic and how we can move forward. And I think what we've done well is that we've always looked at things from a long-term perspective. It's not always what's the problem that we're facing, how do we solve it now, but also how it impacts us for the rest of the coming years. And even, if you look at the latest budget announcement that DPM Heng announced last week, he actually looked at introducing programs and schemes that will take us through to like the next 5 years of a PAP government, talking about the hike of GST that was supposed to come in maybe this year, and talking about how that would impact us further down the road. I think that's a good sign of how Singapore usually plans for these things. To the extent that it has helped us in our US relationship, I think that we've always been very strategic about it, in terms of also, balancing between the US and China. We've had rocky periods with both, but I think it's looking at it from a strategic point of view, knowing, I guess going to Ambassador Lavin's point about where we want to use our political capital, what battles we're able to, just maybe shut one eye or just push forward. I think that that's very important for Singapore. When it comes to ASEAN, we also know that there are, with so many small nations as well as bigger nations in the mix, institutions are very important for Singapore. So not just looking at ASEAN, but also, the World Health Organization, the World Trade Organization, having us punch above our weight, as the Singapore government likes to say, has always been very useful in terms of getting our voices heard. But also ASEAN provides, a unique platform and forum for countries to talk through their issues and try to resolve them in a consensus fashion.
Thank you so much, Nydia. To build upon this idea of Singapore and the role, particularly in its relationship with Singapore, I was going to ask Ambassador Lavin, you do have extensive experience with China, and this is speculation, obviously, but for companies that are looking to come into the region, as you talked a lot about market entry, which is super helpful. And I'm thinking to myself, if a company were thinking of coming to Asia and setting up shop, and they had to decide between Singapore and China / Hong Kong, how do they make that decision?
Yeah.
Right? What kind of considerations must they go through?
Sure. Look, every company is case specific. And so it really depends on your business model and what you are doing in these new markets. So, for example, if you are largely sourcing low-end labor-intensive activity, you might be sourcing heavily from China, in which case you need some kind of China management team, and that's really the main thrust of your Asia footprint is sort of running 20 manufacturing facilities in China. But if you are marketing, the regions are more balanced. Every market's got different kind of value. And for the boutique companies, the smaller companies, mid-sized companies, I would say under 500 million, they have typically limited international capability. So one rule of thumb is calibrate your scope consistent with your capabilities. Don't simply say, I'm going to make a decision on allocating resources based on the size of the market. Don't make it 100% upside calculation. That China is a big market, India is a big market, EU is a big market. Therefore, don't do that, because that's 100% upside calculation. Which, by the way, that's half the calculation. Half the calculation is upside. The other half the calculation is downside. Meaning, what is the complexity and cost of this market? And if you have limited capabilities and you've never really done a lot international, I would honestly tell most American companies, why don't you get your Canada operations and your Mexico operations going? And you're going to learn about foreign exchange. You're going to learn about customs clearance. You're going to learn about tax issues in a new jurisdiction. So you're going to get your capabilities up a bit, right? And so you've got the most homogeneous markets, and you can run to Toronto tomorrow. If you need to run to Toronto tomorrow, you can run to Mexico City, right? But you can't run to Shanghai tomorrow. You can't run to Singapore tomorrow. So step by step, and understand what your capabilities are and go in that kind of fashion, I'd say. So by the way, that's a word of caution about China, unless you are really one of the global majors. If you are Coca-Cola, if you are Toyota, then you need to be deeply into China, right? But if you're a mid-tier company, you've got to balance the upside with the downside.
Yeah, it's an interesting thought that maybe Canada or Mexico closer to home might be an easier way to get going on the international markets. I'm wondering, Stephen, PayPal has done such tremendous work with SMEs. And, is there a different perspective? Because Frank's talked about Toyota and he's talked about P&G, for example, but for SMEs looking to expand into other markets, let's say that we're talking about in the direction of US to Singapore or US to ASEAN. How would small and medium-sized enterprises approach that challenge?
Just want to build onto what Frank has said. So absolutely, your business model and the type of products will determine one of the factors as well. But the other is the industry you're in. And so if your products and services are digital, so social media, streaming, digital payments, digital finance, I think then other factors become much more important. Things like the operational costs, government support, government incentives, infrastructure, rule of law, regulatory landscape, all that then become an important factor in determining where you locate in Hong Kong, Singapore, or elsewhere. On your question around SMEs, SMEs are, again, they're not homogeneous. There are SME of one person and an SME up to 500 people, under 500. And so in that sense, I do think that for SMEs, they're much more sensitive to several factors. One is cost, absolutely, right? The cost of doing business, the potential cost of market entry, the expectations of revenue, and that sort. The other is around consumers and access to markets. And so if, let's say, the interest is around Southeast Asia, then I think it makes sense for SMEs to think about Singapore or elsewhere if the market segment is here in ASEAN. If, to Frank's point, if where you're focusing is around the China market, then it makes sense to be closer to China, whether it's in Hong Kong or in the vicinity. And so I think those become important factors for SMEs. But I think above all, though, for SMEs, it is really support from government, because as they come into a market, they really don't know how to open a bank account, how to get their business license, what requirements are needed in terms of the legal process. And so when markets or economies are organized in terms of, for example, having a single point of contact for SMEs, or having coordinated among the government agencies to provide those support, I think those are really important factors to allow SMEs to actually survive and thrive and scale.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Since I did put in a plug for the commerce team at the US Embassy, I shall now put in a plug for Singapore government. Many of our companies also derive a lot of support from the Economic Development Board here, EDB. So if you're taking notes, you want to write that down. And also Enterprise Singapore is also extremely supportive of businesses, particularly startups. And so if that's a space that you're interested in exploring, those would be two great organizations in Singapore to look into, and they will be very supportive. I'm now going to change gears a little bit. If there are any questions, and I'm not going to call on any names, but because we have many friends in the audience, I do want to encourage you to put in some questions to help us develop our thinking during this dialogue. But I'm going to change directions a little bit into the policy arena. As I mentioned, we received, as part of the survey results of the ASEAN Business Outlook Survey, this feeling that, you know, companies in general in the region are feeling more optimistic about the US. And our survey was conducted in December. So this was after the November election. So clearly, we believe that must be linked, because the increase from the previous year to 2020 was significant. I won't share with the exact numbers, but I'll tell you it's significant. And as an epidemiologist, tell you that number is a big one. So we're very positive about the US here in the region. And we know that also the National Security Council under President Biden has a huge contingent of folks, the team that Ambassador Lavin spoke of, that are looking to re-engage with Asia and think about the Indo-Pacific strategy. Ambassador Lavin, what are the main policy initiatives do you expect from the US in the next, let's say, 6 months to a year?
Yeah, a few things. One, I do think when we are allowed to travel, I think you're going to see a accelerated travel program that might not really materialize for 6 more months or so. But again, the same conversation I said, you know, the president, the vice president, the secretary of state, the secretary of defense, other cabinet level, Kurt Campbell is the Asia czar, whatever his official title is. but let's get around the region. The U.S. has a lot of friends in the region and a lot of countries that want to understand the nature of the U.S. role in the region and how to improve that relationship. And so that opportunity for these conversations, I think, is front and center. And that would be the first goal. I said, be a good listener, be a good partner, be a good collaborator, get in the region and just have a set of conversations to try to understand what people's appetite are, where they're trying to go. That's point one. Point two, there's a very interesting innovation that actually started in the Trump administration, but seems to have taken on a bit of a life, called the Quad. So it's a collaborative mechanism, a coordinating mechanism involving Japan, Australia, India, and the United States. For security issues. It's not an alliance. There are no exercises, so it's not operational, but it is useful to have friends, and it's useful to be able to have these conversations. So I see the Quad having even more of a life, if you will. So those are two steps that I see unfolding over the next year or two. And by the way, I'd add a third one, which is sort of the dog that didn't bark, which is I see. I hope I'm not being subjective here, but I see a significant improvement in tone, which is to say, criticizing countries is fine. But if the primary mechanism of communication is negative, if you're defining the relationship only in negative terms or largely in negative terms, you risk corroding the entire relationship. And you need to, the point of positive and stable relationships is that it actually gives you more potency when you have criticism, right? And so we all know this in our personal lives, that if someone's a good friend and asks us to fix something or do something, we're more inclined to do it. So I'd say, I think the president's already done a very good job by setting that sort of collaborative tone, substantive tone. Not that there won't be all criticisms come and go, but at least you have to have a communications mechanism that people respect and buy into.
Yes, I completely agree. And I think it comes to mind, nice guys finish last. Not true, not true. But I want to stay with you, Ambassador Lavin, because on February 4th, President Biden addressed for the first time the U.S. State Department team. And this is, it's just a question mark for me, and I hope that others share the same question and would like to hear clarification. He said during this statement to the State Department, there's no longer a bright line between foreign and domestic policy. Every action we take in our conduct abroad, we must take with American working families in mind. I don't know enough to really understand. How do you link up foreign policy and domestic policy? I'm sure it has to do with trade. You mentioned labor, but can you just kind of go through that with us a bit more about the thinking behind it?
I view that, with all respect to the president, I think he's being honest. I don't think he's being manipulative, or I think he's being sincere. But I view that as a positioning activity, that what he's trying to do is establish a predicate. So if he says to his domestic constituencies, what I'm doing international is for you. It's not an intellectual exercise. It's not, I'm not a dilettante. It's not because I enjoy this, but it is in your interest that I do these things. He's allowing them to buy in. It makes it easier for them to buy in. And what he's sort of rejecting, I think, is maybe this is an inadvertent practice, but something, or maybe it's overstated, but something sort of crept into U.S. foreign policy management, which was, there probably was at least a perception of a bit of a demarcation, that we have elite-run programs and they have no day-to-day meaning or benefit for people back home. I don't think that's really fair. I mean, I think you'd say if United States in the Cold War is working on stability vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, that has enormous benefit to every American, but you don't necessarily perceive it in that way. And you see Henry Kissinger in Geneva, with Brezhnev or something, and you say, what's this got to do with me? And it's just a waste of time and money. I don't think that was ever really true, but you see how it could be perceived as true. So I think Biden is just making an effort to protect his home base, protect his flank. And by the way, I tried to indicate in my remarks, Jen, I view that as good news. That tells me that he is preparing the ground, so to speak, for some kind of international movement, and he wants to be able to take people with him, right? And he's telling labor and he's telling other constituencies, I hear you. I hear your concerns. I'm not going to do this to abandon you. I'm going to do this to help you. So not bad positioning.
Yeah, I agree. It's very interesting. I just found it a little bit complicated to think through as a, layperson. Like, how does that work?
Well,
And
I'll say
Stephen,
this, it's very unusual. It's very unusual for foreign
ah,
policy management to sort of inject a sort of domestic political
yeah.
messaging into your foreign policy activity, but he's probably wise to do it, right? So
Yeah, I really look forward to learning more about this foreign policy and domestic policy link. And I was going to ask Stephen as well, as a fellow American and as a former State Department employee, thinking back on President Biden's remarks to the team at that time, I'm sure you've read it. It's posted on whitehouse.gov in case anyone wants to read it for themselves. What was your reaction? I realize that you haven't been with the State Department for some time, so this is your personal opinion, but how, as an American and as a former State Department employee, how did you feel after hearing about President Biden's remarks on this? And I know this is not Asia specific, but foreign policy is important for Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, a couple of thoughts that came to mind. One is our role in international organizations. I think we have seen in the past year under the Trump administration, there is a bit of a detachment and withdrawal in U.S. leadership in international organization. The pandemic has shown us that there are no boundaries when it comes to health-related issues. Climate change is another area where it doesn't know, there's no geographic boundaries. I think, Shen, you have in one of your Q&As is a climate change question. And I think you will see a renewed focus and commitment in international organizations. And I think a more emphasis to Americans, the importance for the US to be engaged, because what's happening outside the US will have severe implications domestically. And we have seen the pandemic as an example, how it has now killed 500,000 people. It had, millions have lost their job, etc. Right? All the downstream impact. The second is, as I put myself in the shoe of my former colleagues and listening from a foreign service years, a lot of diplomats and a lot of U.S. Representatives abroad has been impacted from a moral perspective, right? There's a lot. It's easy to target trade. It's easy to target foreign policy, but there are real people behind it. As an American, you're serving your country abroad, and if you're constantly being attacked for your job and for the policy position that you have to carry out on behalf of the U.S. government and the behalf of the U.S. The government, there's a sense of you feel demoralized and you kind of lose your mission. And I think Biden probably is trying to pivot that change that mindset and say, hey, we hear you, we see you, you are Americans, you represent us internationally, and there is a domestic you're doing a domestic importance for the US by representing abroad.
Yeah, thank you for that. Nydia, as a Singaporean, we're all here in Singapore, actually. Domestic news clearly still headlines, right? We see a lot about the economy, we see a lot about COVID-19, but this interesting play between foreign and domestic policy, and then with the U.S. What is Singapore's take on needing to look out domestically, but also having this form, constantly, because Singapore is surrounded by so many countries and given the size and whatnot. What's Singapore's take on, do you think, on President Biden's approach to foreign policy?
I think we've always had to play that role, of balancing both domestic interests and foreign interests. And I think, interestingly, the Singapore elections, brought about some very interesting discussions on FTAs and how they benefit Singapore and whether or not they go beyond benefiting companies. And I think that this is an interesting take, and definitely welcome, Singaporeans to be actively playing a role in negotiations and agreements that would impact them. I think when we look at negotiating FTAs, it's always been how this would benefit Singapore. And I think, when we look at President Biden and him coming in, it's definitely one of hope, one of relief. I think, we've been missing a lot of US leadership, especially in the international institutions in the last couple of years. And I think everyone is very hopeful that there will be some return to normalcy going forward. That being said, there's also a lot of, I think, tension between the domestic and foreign that countries and governments will always have to deal with. And I think there are some very positive steps that have been taken. For instance, how the U.S. have unblocked and welcomed the new Director General for the WTO. But then, with that said, how will they go forward from there? What would be the U.S. stance towards the appellate body discussions that have been going on where they've blocked appointments with the World Health Organization. They talk about contributing to COVAX in millions of dollars, I believe, but then what next, right? So I think it's all very early stages and early days, and I think Singapore does recognize the fact that there's a lot of internal work to be done for the US, and I think too that there's also going to be a lot of focus inwards, right? Catherine Tai had, made remarks at the National Foreign Trade Council a couple weeks ago that her two main trade concerns for President Biden would be confronting China and ensuring the US-Mexico-Canada agreement lives up to its promising potential. So with those two main concerns in mind, where does the rest of the world and where does Asia Pacific fit in? I think that's something that, we definitely want to have greater clarity on. But even when we look at trade issues, there are issues left over from the Trump era, which, includes the expiration of the generalized system of preferences, there are trade enforcement issues, and the fate of, mini trade deals with Japan and China. And then when you consider that, the president's trade policy agenda to Congress is typically submitted in 1st of March, is that still going to happen? And those are a lot of, I think, like signposts to let us know what the Biden administration is thinking of and provide greater clarity to the Singapore government. But I think, just going back to your question of what Singapore's take, I think, we recognize that there's a lot of work to be done, both internally and externally. And I think we want to make sure that we get heard, but at the same time, we are also going to be practical and not try to, weasel our way in when they're still dealing with a lot of things. Like there's a time and place for everything, I think. And
True.
the ASEAN events or the APEC events happening towards the latter half of the year, I think that's when, people will really start weighing in if the administration hasn't done much more beforehand.
Yeah, good point. I mean, World Economic Forum is meant to be held in Singapore in August. That's another important milestone for the year. We're certainly looking forward to seeing more developments. I'm going to take Stephen up on his offer to segue over to climate change. As I mentioned at the very beginning of our session, one of my passions, of course, is science, being a scientist and connecting it to business. And we see that in the administration. Yesterday, I happened to retweet one of President Biden's tweets, which he says, "I told you I would listen to the scientists. Now look at me listening to the scientists." And I loved it. Climate change and science has always been something very important to Singapore government. I mean, let's think back, 20 years ago or so, when Singapore government decided to invest in bioscience, right? Biotechnology, setting up the Biopolis. My big dream was to work at the Biopolis. What a cool name that is for a very important part of Singapore. So Singapore recognizes the importance of science, recognizes that climate change must be very high on the agenda for the sustainability of our civilization. The US rejoined the Paris Climate Accord last week, and our new Secretary of State, Tony Blinken's statement highlighted the importance of science in domestic and foreign policy. And to share his quote from his statement, he said, "It is vital in our discussions of national security, migration, international health efforts, and in our economic diplomacy and trade talks." So this is climate change that he's referring to and science. Nydia, is this what is Singapore thinking along this track? Because we have seen the formation of the new Ministry for Sustainability and the Environment led by Minister Grace Fu. So exciting. We have seen references to other countries' approach to climate change, such as the polders to manage increasing sea levels. We have also seen recently more conversation around electric cars, right? My sister in the San Francisco Bay Area has been driving an electric car for who knows how long, so jealous. Here in Singapore, it is finally seeming to be something that the government is encouraging. So where is Singapore government thinking at when it comes to climate change and science?
I think Singapore has always, been at the forefront of that. I think we've always, liked to back up whatever we do or say with a lot of facts and figures, and I think that's where science comes into play to help substantiate those value propositions. I think Singapore recently launched its Singapore Green Plan 2030. I think earlier this month or last month, and we're very excited to hear more, especially with the Committee of Supply debates that are going to be happening in starting today and going for the next couple of weeks, when ministries and agencies kind of outline their plans for the year going forward after the budget announcement. And I think there'll be a lot more that's going to be shared with the Singapore Green Plan. And I think Singapore has already been looking at renewable energies. So that's something that companies can look towards in terms of opportunities and partnering with the Singapore government. I think, Singapore's National Climate Change Secretariat worked with EDB and the Energy Market Authority to conduct a hydrogen feasibility study in September 2019. So that's something that, we're keeping in mind. We're already partnering also with other countries to develop hydrogen markets, supply chains, and standards. So Singapore signed an MOU with Australia in October 2020 to drive cooperation on low emission solutions. And also more recently signed an MOU with Chile for the collaboration on low carbon technologies on February 14, 2021. So, this will include exchange of information and policies on the management and development of hydrogen-related technology and resources, scaling up a domestic hydrogen economy in both countries, setting up supply chains and strengthening networks. And then, of course, with EVs coming up, I think that's going to be great. I hope you're going to get a Tesla, Hsien, at some point.
You can order them online now.
Yeah, road taxes are going to be adjusted, so that mass market EVs pay road taxes that are comparable to conventional cars. And the Singapore government is looking to narrow the cost differential between EVs and petrol and diesel vehicles. So that's, I think it just goes to show, how much thought Singapore has put into making sustainability a big pillar going forward. And it goes back to building up Singapore's resiliency and being aware of the constraint of resources that we have, like, we still depend on water in Malaysia, but then how do we work around these constraints to make sure that Singapore is able to survive in its own right and grow resilient in that sense.
Yeah, thank you so much for all those great examples. Fantastic. Ambassador Lavin, just on the broader topic of bringing science back and believing in science, do you think it's a difficult transition for the US government to do so? And how does it, change their perceptions of all else they do? Because Secretary Blinken said that science is vital in pretty much every discussion.
Well, look, I'm glad to hear him say that. I think it's yet to be tested. I think Biden is taking environmental issues more seriously, and that's certainly consistent with a more serious scientific approach. But it's also worth noting that that's what his constituency and those who voted for him want also. So I think the assertion you posited is a great one, and I think you could only test it when you say science is obliging him to go against some of his constituencies, and then you say, boy, this guy really is being led by this principle of scientific rationalism, and he's not just playing politics. So look, I'm glad he's doing what he's doing with climate science, but I wouldn't say that intrinsically proves the thesis that he's now for science, because because this is what politics argues for in any event. It might be something like, for example, when we talk trade issues with the Europeans always take a dimmer view of GMO food than the US does. Right. So it might be something like that to say, look, all of science tells us that GM food has been out there for 20 years, has enormous benefits in having tomatoes that don't bruise or other kind of elements of your food chain, enormously helpful in the third world in getting efficiencies up. And so that would be maybe an argument of sticking by science rather than playing politics with it. So I'm glad to hear the rhetoric, and I think the jury's still a bit out on where he stands on that.
Yep. Stephen, can you give us the business perspective on climate change and how PayPal is addressing sustainability?
Sure. I think, if I think about issues that are clear and present danger to the region, I think climate change is pretty much up there, especially in a region here in ASEAN where we're so prone to floodings, typhoons, earthquakes, and many of the natural disasters. I think I saw a report from McKinsey last year that said that by 2050, climate change, natural disasters, including drought and lethal heat waves, could impact 600 million to 1 billion people in this region, to potentially lethal to about 20% of that number. And so if you think about, upwards of 200 million people could lose their lives because of climate change in the next 30 years, it is no other clear and present danger that I see of. There's also an economic impact as well. I mean, along with that estimates, there's estimated that 2.8 to $5 trillion in GDP could be impacted by climate change. So from that perspective, I think there are a lot of opportunities in these areas to address climate change. I think, Hsien, you mentioned electrical vehicle is one of the aspects of it. Nydia mentioned about government taking a greater role in addressing climate change through some of the public sector initiatives. That's the other piece of it. But financial services angle, there is green investment. I think that's one area that is rapidly developing and rapidly popular too in the region. We have seen statistics, for example, from The Economist that survey investors in the region, and it's estimated that 68% of investors intend to increase their allocation in sustainable finance over the next 3 years, and projected that 25 to 50% of their AUM, this is asset under management in their portfolios, would be some form of sustainable investment during that period. And so there is a massive demand, interest, and need for to address climate change. I think you'll see more and more businesses will be involved in this discussion from an investment perspective. Decreasing their own carbon footprint is the other piece of it. And then finally is to raise that level of awareness and through collaboration, through public-private partnerships in the region.
Thank you so much for your perspective on that. I'm now going to bring us back together. We're going to draw this to a close because at 11:30, the young leaders of the Pacific Forum, they will be having a closed door dialogue. So I'm going to actually ask each of our speakers to come back to the theme of US-Singapore economic relations and share with us your vision of the future for US-Singapore economic relations. Ambassador Lavin, can I ask you to start sharing your vision?
Thank you, Hsien. Let me begin by first thanking you and thanking the other co-sponsors for being such a wonderful host. Thank my panelists also for adding a lot. So it's been a really good evening for me here. I do. This is a lovely question. I really want to comment on something that I don't think has come up at all, which is there's been this really intriguing evolution in Singapore that I very much admire, and I think it's just worth putting the spotlight on for a second. Historically, Singapore as an economic philosophy, as a trade policy, it said, look, we want to be the most inviting platform in the region. We're going to be the lowest tariffs, the most transparent regulatory environment. We want to be as inviting as possible for all participants, for trade, investment, locating a regional headquarters. We want your business, right? I think very wise, very wise. In the last few years, I've seen an evolution beyond that to say we actually want to actively work with you in specialized areas to craft the environment you want. And I see this in fintech, and I see this in medtech. And fintech and medtech are booming, huge industries, but they're also completely footloose. They could be in London or Boston or Hong Kong or Singapore. And It can be segmented. You can put 80% of your business in Boston and 20% in Singapore, right? Easily. So it's very wise, I think, for the regulatory bodies, the cabinet ministries and MAS to say, if you have a good idea, we want to talk with you. Tell us your idea. We want to work with any reasonable party in helping create an atmosphere of the sandbox, they call it, where you can test your idea in this market. So bring your team here, bring your test here, work with us. We'll craft with you, we'll give you a carve out to do it. I think it's very clever, and I think it's going to pay off big. I think there's going to be a very nice fintech industry here, a very nice that will serve Singapore well. And once you get that cluster effect, then you sort of become you become the global hub. So I think Singapore is very much on the right path with that. And I the initiative, good for them to have that. You know, US has the enormous advantage, but sometimes a disadvantage of this huge home market. So the regulators aren't always as nimble. The regulators say, well, people are going to come anyhow, right? If we're forward leaning or backward leaning, people have got to come, which is, you know, sort of true, but you're leaving the innovation out of it if you don't move. So congratulations, Singapore, for feeling their way in those two important areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Lavin. Stephen, I've got to ask you to comment on that. Ambassador Lavin's been talking about fintech. What's your vision of the future for U.S.-Singapore economic relations?
Just want to emphasize, you know, how thankful I am and appreciative of your effort, AmCham Singapore and the Pacific Forum for organizing this event. Just to build on that, you know, we spent a lot of time talking about opportunities and collaborations and some of the potential partnerships, but there are also a lot of challenges doing business here in the region that we didn't, you know, address too much. Things like a very high level market fragmentation, lack of harmonization across the region on standards and regulations. We have geopolitical risk issue as well in the region. But what it means is that it presents opportunity for stronger Singapore-US partnership and relationship. And some of those issues could be addressed through those engagements. An example is in the area of digital trade, understanding that the US and Singapore has a free trade agreement, but Singapore is championing some of these bilateral and multilateral trade frameworks in the region in the area of digital trade, looking at addressing areas such as, you know, cross-border data flows, looking at emerging technologies. How do you take out some of the frictions with digital services? How do you grow the digital economy? There's an opportunity for the US to enhance that engagement and to be a partner in the region for that, because it will help American companies to capture some of those opportunities by taking away some of those challenges.
Wow, I went that long without having a problem with my mute button. That's pretty good. Thank you so much, Stephen. Nydia, I will ask you to close out this segment. And I realize now something was wrong with my Zoom. Only the questions popped up now, but you will have a chance to ask the speakers questions in the following segment, which will be closed doors. So Nydia, I'll ask you to share your vision of the future for US-Singapore economic relations.
Thanks, Hsien, and thank you to AmCham Singapore and Pacific Forum for having us. This has been a really insightful discussion, and I think, you know, for a vision of US-Singapore economic relations, I think the US just really needs to show up and also understand that, you know, certain both sides, I think, need to understand that there are some things that have changed and have evolved, and we'll have to, you know, evolve with it. So if we're looking at free trade agreements, I think that, you know, when we look at it in the lens of the bilateral relationship, it's sort of, I feel like that whole platform has sort of sailed. And why I say that is because if you look at the big regional agreements like RCEP, for instance, how does it impact, you know, companies in Singapore? I would say not very much, just because Singapore already has existing free trade agreements with each of the other 14 countries. You know, I think the plurilateral pact really presents marginal benefits to US companies already in Singapore. With the CPTPP, for instance, you know, it's always been more of a strategic agreement looking at anchoring the US to this region. And, you know, if we were to look in the traditional FTA sense, if the US wants to come back to the TPP or to anything else, I think it may be that the US is no longer a price setter, but a price taker. And is this something that the US is willing to accept? We also need to consider whether or not the region is willing to accept what the US is going to put out in terms of being worker-centric and worker-focused. And that's, labor rights in TPP or the labor provisions was always something that was an issue for discussion, especially for the countries that are not as developed. So I do think that, going forward, sector agreements might be the way for the US as it starts to rebuild its trade policy and refocus itself on how it can really play a positive role in this region. And so thank you very much for having us. And I look forward to further questions from the young leaders.
Thank you so much, Nydia. Again, I want to apologize for not having gotten to the questions in the Q&A box, but I believe Nydia, Ambassador Lavin, and Stephen are all accessible on LinkedIn. So please feel free to reach out directly if you have a very specific question. I noticed many of them were very detailed. So thank you once again for your engagement. Thank you once again on behalf of the American Chamber of Commerce in Singapore. Thank you to our speakers for your amazing knowledge and your generosity in sharing your time. Thank you so much. I'm going to hand it now over to Pacific Forum.